Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Hot Mic Cold Virus. I'm your host, Rochelle Beard, and I'm very excited to introduce my guests for today's episode about science communication. For those of you who may not be familiar, I have Aaron Welsh and Aaron Allman Updike, the hosts and creators of one of my absolute favorite podcasts, This Podcast Will Kill You. So welcome, Aaron. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks so much for having us. We are
Yeah.
thrilled to be here.
We're super excited.
So for those who aren't familiar with you, like maybe all like 53 of my listeners that might be tuning in today, if they're not familiar with you or your podcast, go ahead and let them know. Fill in about yourself and your podcast and how it got started, what you do, and all those good things.
Sure. Yeah. I can start with the beginning of the story. So I'm Aaron Welsh. My background, similar to Aaron Allman Updike, we both have masters in epidemiology, and we were both in the same lab at the University of Illinois getting our PhDs in vector-borne disease ecology specifically. And that's when we decided to start this podcast. And so our backgrounds are kind of come from this both like epidemiology, disease ecology perspective. And then, we decided to create this podcast because we were really tired of talking about our science in such a stilted and kind of like removed way, where we had to use impersonal language. We had to talk in the third person kind of a thing. And we were like, this is not like, we find this so fascinating, but the way we're talking about it is really boring. I mean, it's like, it's effective, it's precise, it's what is how you should talk about science. But yes, all of that led to us creating This Podcast Will Kill You, which is a podcast where we talk about the biology, the history, and the current research on diseases and lots of other medical topics. And Aaron, there's more to the story. I think you could probably fill us in.
I don't know. That was a pretty good summary of it, honestly.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying with the like talking about science, and that it is boring.
Mm-hmm.
And the average person does not understand the statistical language or the specific like research language and the percentages and those kind of things. And even if you do understand it, it doesn't really make it interesting to read all these numbers.
Yeah.
So I feel like your podcast, especially with the way that you start a bunch of the episodes with like the storytelling, then that's a way to really like drag people in and get them engaged and more interested in what you're going to talk about than saying the hypothesis we fail to instead of going into all that. That's so exciting. So I like that aspect of getting people really engaged from the jump with that storytelling component.
Yeah. We knew when we sort of decided to start this podcast that our goal was to get a very wide, like a very general audience. We wanted for people who had like no background in science or thought they had no interest in science. And then also not be so like watered down in what we were talking about, that people who did have a background would be like, oh, this is boring because it's like lost all of the nuance.
Yeah.
And so throughout what is it, almost 8 years now that we've been doing the podcast, we've kind of tried to strike that balance of like hitting enough of the like deep dive on the science, because that's part of what we love, but then incorporating these firsthand accounts, these narratives of the, diseases or conditions that we're talking about, the history of like, how has this thing affected humanity throughout all of time, and kind of where do we stand with this story today is kind of how we've always framed things. And we think that it really does give a much broader perspective than what you would probably get in like a biology class, for example. And like loved my biology classes. That's how we ended up where we are, but not everyone does.
You don't really want to listen to your biology class when you're like on a long road trip and want something to like keep you awake as you're driving. Whereas I feel like could listen to your episodes and they are engaging and like watered down enough to where you don't feel like your brain's working to follow along, which is great. And I think you made a really good point talking about you wanted to make it available to everyone, whether they had zero scientific knowledge to scientific experts. And I want to just give a loose definition to the whole point of this episode of the podcast is science communication. And the whole concept of science communication is simply getting scientific information to the general public, to a general audience, getting scientific knowledge to non-experts. So podcasts are obviously a good example of that. Journalism, commercials, public outreach, other versions of digital media, even museums and science centers are forms of scientific communication. Totally. Again, you're going there or taking your children there, thinking that you're just having a good time, but you're getting that scientific information and that science communication. That is the whole point of the exhibit or whatever is going on. And I think I would kind of think back to like COVID times. People might understand more about all the scientific communication or science communication that was going on was more in your face because you wanted to inform the public about scientific findings regarding the vaccine or what was going on with the illness, helping raise awareness and interest in science. I mean, I think the pandemic in general did that, getting it on everyone's radar. And then influencing attitudes and behaviors about science is another thing. Again, I think with COVID, same thing. You were getting into a drawing for getting a COVID vaccine, or they were, we're all in this together, get your vaccine, we're going to get through this, really helping to influence everyone's involvement and attitudes, and then helping inform public policy decisions. So just because someone is a leader or someone in enforcing legislation or working on it doesn't mean that they know everything about science. So you need to make sure even some of the science communication that is an article or a podcast that is directed at them as well.
If only.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
We'll get to that a little bit, right? So why do you think that podcasts work so well for science communication?
I think that, I mean, podcasts are amazing because I was just thinking, as you're going through all these different ways to use science communication to reach different audiences. And I was thinking like, gosh, really some of the best science communication there is, or the most effective, are the sneaky ones where you don't realize that you're actually being taught science at the same time. Where it's like, you go to a museum and it's great, but like when there's a story there, it's not like you're sitting in a lecture being lectured at. And so I think that's what works really well about podcasts, or about, This Podcast Will Kill You. One of the things that we found, and we didn't do this intentionally. Like when we started, we had no idea. I don't even know if we knew the phrase science communication.
I don't know if we did, Erin.
I don't think that we did. I think we heard SciComm and I was like, I feel like I'm supposed to know what that is. What is that?
Sounds like a movie genre.
Yeah, right? And so we didn't have any idea that, by starting this podcast and that our approach to it. And so it really took a lot of self-reflection later on and thinking, okay, what are the things that we are doing that we think is working? What are things that people are connecting with? And one of those things was this conversational style. When Erin and I record an episode, we are preparing stuff that we learned that we're telling each other. And we're not telling our audience directly. Like I'm teaching Erin about the history of, the most recent episode we recorded was toxic shock syndrome. So I'm like, this is how the first cases came about. This is what people learned. This is how the investigation happened. Erin doesn't know any of that, or she maybe only knows like some pieces of that.
No, I know nothing.
Well, and similarly, I know nothing about the biology of toxic shock syndrome. And so then when she's telling me, I'm learning it for the first time. And I feel like being able to witness that conversation, that learning in action from, from like a third person, just if you're listening to the podcast, I feel like that really helps because it takes the pressure off of learning, and it allows you to witness sort of, okay, well, if there are follow-up questions, which parts seem to be difficult for one of us to follow, which parts are easy, are there any sort of opportunities to explore in more depth? And so I feel like that's why podcasts are this kind of sneaky, relaxed way where you're listening to a conversation, but really you're watching somebody learn something in the process, and you yourself are learning.
Yeah. I think the other thing that we didn't necessarily expect about podcasts, but like thinking back, it's part of, I think, why we like podcasts, is that you can listen to them in so many different places. And so you're just like getting this exposure to things that you normally would maybe just be like empty space or empty time, right? Like we used to listen so much like in the lab, like while you're pipetting, what else are you going to do? Listen to a podcast.
Yeah.
And then you're learning this stuff while you're doing something else. And so like on your drive into work, while you're walking the dog, whatever it is, however people listen, it's just this like space that they now can learn new things where before they just maybe weren't doing anything. And so I feel like it's another thing that makes it just kind of an interesting medium to be able to reach people. They can do it while they're doing something else. You don't have to have 100% of your focus on the podcast to still be able to enjoy it and then potentially get something out of it.
Yeah, you could be passively learning something and you don't even have any idea.
Yeah.
A couple days later, someone might say something that was discussed in the podcast. Like, oh, I am familiar with that.
Yeah.
So you guys have done roughly like 170 episodes. This podcast will kill you. So you said 7 years, 170 episodes. So you're pros at this point.
Doesn't always feel that way.
No, it doesn't. But
well, it looks that way.
Technically we are.
Oh, there you go. What would you say have you seen on like the impact of your podcast specifically? What kind of impact on the public's understanding have you seen your podcast make over the last 170 episodes? Or have you not seen? I mean, I think you probably have, but what impact?
Yeah. That's a good question. I mean, on the public overall, I don't know.
I don't know that we have that big of a reach, but
yeah. But I think that one of the most surprising and honestly like surreal and makes us cry every time we get one of these emails is when someone reaches out and said, oh, I started listening to you back in high school on the recommendation of my science teacher, and now I'm starting my MPH. And like stuff like that, that has been so incredible. And I think, obviously COVID really helped to expose the general public to the field of public health and epidemiology and all of the different careers that are possible within that. And I think that our podcast too has also been part of this conduit for people to see that there is this whole world of public health of using, the knowledge that we have about medicine and the human body and diseases and populations in a way that's not going to med school and being a doctor necessarily, but it's being able to see this broad impact and the many different ways that it impacts every facet of our lives. And I think that's something that has been really incredible to witness. Like we gave a talk at IU recently, and a professor in the School of Public Health, was that right, Erin? The School of Public Health
maybe
came up to us afterwards and said, I just want to thank you for the number of students that I've had in my class say, I joined this class, I started this program because of this podcast will kill you. And that was like, I just got chills. I just can't.
Awesome.
It's so surreal. Like I can't believe it. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Erin and I, like we started this podcast for fun, right? Because we love these topics. We love learning. Like that's why we've been in school for 150 years. We're finally done with school, but, and so I think that, we had these dreams of like doing something with our lives and with our career that like had a public health impact, right? That like could help make this world a little bit better. Like that's our naive goal. I think that's the naive goal of so many people in public health. And to know that we are doing that from emails like this, from people that are now going into public health, or even people who are just excited about science, who thought they weren't excited about science.
Yeah.
Or who are getting vaccines that maybe they were hesitant to get or they had never gotten before. Like that is the part that keeps us going and is just so unbelievably meaningful to us. So it's really incredible.
You talked about how you intentionally make your content digestible for a bunch of people. So how do you balance the entertainment aspect with the accuracy aspect, and then also balancing making it accessible without oversimplifying your information?
Yeah. It's a hard balance to strike. And I think that, Erin, I think that your answer will probably be somewhat similar to mine, because I mean, also, I feel like I talk about the history of it, which I think is interesting, because I'm learning it for the first time, that means that I am having to put together what I am finding interesting about this story already. So I am already, like, my process is to immerse myself in whatever topic that it is. And that means reading it basically as much as possible. And sometimes that thread will start to emerge right away. And I know that's the story that I want to tell. And so let me focus on that story and let all the rest of the details kind of fall away. And then other times it is more difficult. And I'm like, what is the story here? Where do I want to focus this? And again, it comes down to, well, what do I find interesting? And then sometimes I'll run that by my husband and I'll be like, do you find this interesting? Does this part, do you think I need to tell this story or that part of the story? And I think that reflection is really important. So now I've taken to rereading. I mean, like, I'm embarrassed to admit that, like, for years, I would rarely read over my notes after putting them together. I would just be like, this is fine. And then I've started to just read them over out loud before we record an episode so that I know, like, no one needs to know this. Like, I'm sure that it's interesting, but no one needs to know this. And so I'll cut that out and just sort of try to have enough detail to make the story interesting, but not be so detail focused. And then, of course, I think the other thing that always helps is to add in sources at the end where we say, like, if you are interested more about this or that, then here's where to go.
Yeah. Yeah. Similarly, I think because I do the biology section, I kind of have like key points that I know I'm going to want to get across for pretty much every topic, especially if it's something like an infectious disease. I know we're going to talk about what the pathogen is. We're going to talk about the transmission. We're going to talk about the signs and symptoms. We're going to talk about treatment. Like, we know the like basics of what we're going to cover. I think where I always sort of still struggle is, like, I could deep dive on things and then go like real nitty gritty. And so I always have to kind of pull myself out and say, how much background knowledge do I think that people have? How much do I need to give them? And how much time is it going to take to get to that level of detail? And if it's going to take a really long time to explain this one point that I think is really cool, do we really need it? Or could we sort of leave that on the table and not get into it? I also, like, after so many years of doing the podcast together, I know what Erin is going to want to know, like,
which I love.
So I know when she's going to ask me a question, like, well, why does it do that? Like, how exactly does it do the thing? Like, why does that rash happen the way that it does?
I'm predictable.
I know. And so then I can, that's the place where I might then dig a little bit deeper and maybe have some additional information on that. But it is always a constant balance. I also use my husband a lot when I'm like, okay, does this analogy make sense if I explain this thing in this way? And I think analogies are a really good way to make something seem simpler without actually watering it down at all. It's just that you're relating this complicated topic to something that somebody actually already knows about. And so it allows them to build that connection for themselves. And we do that a lot. Erin is really good at analogies.
I don't think so.
You are.
How bad
You're really good at bad analogies.
Yes,
stick in people's minds.
I like how you talked about you use your husband's or the people around you to kind of bounce the topics off. Like, if I asked my husband, explained something scientific to my husband and asked him if he understood it, works in construction. If he understood it, then I think I did a good job. So I think that's great. Use the people around you to kind of strike that balance.
Yeah.
You guys obviously have a really good relationship and a friendship, and by default you have a good time and you laugh a lot. So what role does humor play in making science more engaging and more entertaining and getting people involved?
Yeah, I think it's key. I mean, I don't think that sometimes I think we're funnier than we actually are, but or maybe we're
well, that's where it comes in. You're just listening to a conversation.
Exactly.
Listening in on your all's conversation. So that makes sense.
I think, I think part of it is just being ourselves, really. And I think that is what the truth of our podcast is that we are just being ourselves. We're talking to each other. Yes, we're trying to explain things to a broad audience, but really we're just sitting there talking to each other, and we genuinely are friends. And so I think that it's really the key is kind of being yourself in explaining things. And so for some people that might be making like silly jokes or things like that. And for other people, it might be something different. But I do think that it is part of it is part of just sort of being human about what we're talking about and not trying to be like this very buttoned up version of ourselves, but just being ourselves and who we are. And I think that people connect with that because when you are a real human person, people can sense that and they kind of connect with that a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes too, we laugh because otherwise we would cry because that's, and so that's also a coping mechanism.
I understand for sure. So do you guys have any like memorable or funny moments or bloopers from over the years of podcasting?
That's a great question. I'm trying to think of like bloopers. I mean, we've certainly cut out a lot of content over the years.
I sometimes think if we could go back and compile all of the ridiculousness, that would be,
oh my gosh,
it would be something.
It could be a fun episode.
It could be a fun episode. I would hate to edit that episode.
Yeah, no, it would be miserable.
I feel like I'm trying to think of some memorable moment. I mean, I always have such a fond memory for like, we only recorded this podcast Will Kill You in person with each other for like the first year of making the podcast. And then we were remote. We recorded on Zoom before it was cool. Actually, it was on Skype. So it was well Skype. Before anything was cool. Yeah.
We used it until it was like, you really shouldn't be using this anymore. There are much better technologies out there.
I think honestly, one of the most like looking back on it, it's funny now. I think at the time it was not funny, which was our very first episode. Oh, yeah. We recorded it because we had this idea and we were like, okay, let's do it. Aaron was the one who was driving us like, we've got the equipment. We're going to do this. We're doing it on this date. Get ready. Have your notes ready. And I was like, okay, I guess this is happening, like whether I like it or not. Because like the idea was fun, but then the execution was painful. So when we did sit down to actually record it, we talked for, I don't know how long. It feels like I just like blacked out during that whole time, the first recording. And we walked out of the room and we were like, well, we tried it and we're never doing this again. This was a horrible experience. Like we had fun, I guess, in recording it, but it just felt, I don't know why it felt so bad to do. And I think it
really
was
bad. It really did.
Yeah. Like I haven't really reflected on why it felt so bad.
Yeah.
But
then
imposter syndrome, maybe like
imposter syndrome. I think that it was like maybe the vision that we had in our head we didn't execute it well.
Didn't match what we thought it could be, maybe.
Yeah. I think for myself, I felt like the first one we were, I think, modeling after a lot of the podcasts that we were listening to, where it was very loosey-goosey, kind of just like rough notes, you follow whatever, you go on tangents. And that is the part that I was like, I don't remember anything that I'm supposed to be talking about. And so I'm like, is that the right detail? What about this statistic? Is that right? Like, and that felt to me like, no, I need to be more prepared the next time we do this. If there is a next time. And so I think in retrospect, that was really funny because that ended up being that when we recorded that ended up being our first episode. And just once we edited it down and like, we're like, okay, well, you know what? This is not going to be perfect. It's never going to be perfect. So we just have to let it out there. But yeah, that feeling was truly painful.
on that awful note, what are some challenges that you have found in communicating infectious disease topics to the public?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like there's a lot of different ways that you could take this. I think there was a big challenge, especially during COVID, so for us, we are not experts and we don't present ourselves as experts. And yet, because we are communicating science, a lot of people are looking to us for our expertise. And so one of the things that sometimes becomes challenging, especially during a time like COVID, where information was changing so rapidly because we were getting new information, nobody had all of the answers. It can become really challenging to feel like you are doing the best possible job. And so I think that that's something that we still struggle with, where we're like, we want to have as much of this information as possible, but we know that we're never going to be experts in whatever the topics are. And so, I mean, during COVID, we interviewed experts. And so that was like the way that we handled that, where we took ourselves out of the position of being the ones to explain the things, and rather we were the ones asking questions. But I think that kind of balance is sometimes hard, at least for me, to kind of make sure that I'm explaining all of the information, I'm being as accurate as possible, and just kind of to balance everything. I think that's one of the things that's hard for me, at least.
Yeah. I mean, I think with infectious disease, or I think just the topics in general that we cover, I think it's feeling like we are doing a good enough job of being comprehensive, but also not exhaustive. Like, we don't expect anyone to come to our podcast to learn everything that they could ever possibly know about a particular topic. And so I think that balancing, again, going back to balancing of the detail, is really hard. And then also just there are times when I feel like when it comes to specifically vaccines, it can be difficult to communicate in a balanced way. And I don't mean balanced as in like both sides. I mean like to not feel, to not directly focus on the anti-vax portion of the population, which is much, much, much smaller than, of course, the people who are vaccine, who do have vaccinate their kids and themselves, right? And so I think that anticipating and being defensive of that, or being like, well, let's address this, and this about when it comes to the, myths about vaccines. I think it's a challenge in terms of what is the best approach to take. Like, how do we talk about vaccines? How do we talk about vaccine hesitancy? How do we talk about vaccine safety in a way that is both balanced and also empathetic to the people who do have genuine questions about vaccines? And that is what we have tried to do, because I think that there's this approach that I think is tempting to take, where it's just like complete dismissal of everyone who is vaccine hesitant or anti-vax is a danger to themselves and their communities and their kids. And like, to some degree, maybe that is true if they are spreading this information willy-nilly with the intention of undermining trust in scientific institutions. But on the other hand, it's like, we have to, then how do we make any progress if we're dismissing this entire group at large? Like, how do we actually reach people who are reachable? So I think that's been a real challenge that we have tried to, I think, do a lot of research and reading on how to overcome that, how to actually make those connections.
Yeah.
Have you all encountered people reaching out to you, whether it be sending you an email or on social media, who have directly been like, you're wrong, you're spreading bad information, this is the way it's supposed to be? And how have you combated that? Or do you just let it go?
We let it go.
We let it go.
Our approach since very early on. And it's interesting to think too about how I won't even call it criticism, but how those types of responses have changed over time, because they have. But yeah, when people come at us with genuine questions like, hey, I don't understand this, and this, that is something that maybe we'll make a whole new episode about. Maybe it's hard to reach out to everyone directly. In all honesty, we don't do as good of a job as we wish we could on like responding to people via email or like in our DMs or on social media. We're really, really bad at it because it's just the two of us. We don't have anyone helping us with that. But we try, if people have genuine questions, we try in some way or another to like get those questions addressed when we can. But when people are just coming at us saying, oh, you're, a shill for big pharma, or you're just totally wrong. Oh, you must be getting paid by such and such. Like, it's just so ridiculous. Those people we just don't engage with. So they're just, you never get engaged with. And that's the end, because it's not worth our time to have a fight on the internet with people who aren't, they're not at all genuine about learning something new.
Yeah.
Is that the same as if you got a private message or a public comment?
Yep. Yeah. It just goes to the spam folder.
Yeah.
Do you have strategies for combating misinformation, specifically on social media, or I guess on a person-to-person basis, like for people who are listening, how they can help combat that wrong information?
Yeah. I mean, I think there are some great resources out there. I think that there's step one is always to kind of like pick your battles, like which people have genuine questions and and do have space to, consider, your opinion, right? So there's like the, motivational interviewing, of course, asking, but trying to get at what that person's concerns or fears are. So if my little sister has questions about birth control, for instance, what are those questions? What are the fears? What has she heard? So that I think for me, getting all of that information first is a great way to be like, okay, what is, first of all, what are some of the things that are circulating right now? What are your specific concerns for yourself? And how is this misinformation working for you?
Mm-hmm.
And then trying to say, okay, well, can we research this together? And can we come up with information together? And I think that, knowledge is power. And so finding good sources, which is, can be very tricky, I think. And maybe that's something that we'll touch on later, but, reliable internet sources is a challenging thing to do. But once you have those, to have those in your arsenal, and if somebody is willing to engage with you, then try to go down that path. But if they're not, then you just can't. Like, there's what can you do? You can push to a certain point, but if you're not going to get anywhere with it, just you have to stop. You have to not waste your time with that.
Yeah, I think there's so many different approaches, and I think that what Erin said about picking your battles, I think, is really the key. Because all of us can potentially make a difference, but a lot of it is work that happens in our own communities, whether that be with your family, whether that be with your friends, and whether that be on the internet or in person. So I think for us with the podcast, the strategy that we have always taken is to present as much accurate information as we can and to share that information as widely as we can. And so that is kind of our way of trying to combat misinformation that might be out there by providing resources, where can you find more information, and then also factual information. Then on the other side, there's also these conversations that you can have. So like in my other half of my life, I'm also like a primary care provider. And so I deal with these individual conversations every single day of, like Erin said, trying to understand where is somebody coming from? Why, like, tell me about your thoughts on the flu vaccine. Like, have you ever gotten one? What are your worries about it? Like, trying to understand where that person is coming from. And that is something that's really hard to do in a comment section online. And so that's the reason that we just like don't engage when it comes to those conversations online. And there are tons of people who do, and that's excellent, because if that's within your bandwidth to like either get into those conversations or at least like start to engage in those conversations online, then that's awesome, because that's a whole nother medium that just, for us, it's not the battle that we're fighting, but for some people it might be. And, there's also so many people who are like making, like reaction videos or this and that. And I think there's pros and cons to every different approach. It's really just finding the ways that you feel comfortable and confident in talking about the topics and trying to kind of combat some of that mis and disinformation.
I really like the points you guys both made about hearing the people out first, because it doesn't do either of you any good, what the person, like yourself or the person who has the skepticism, to you just spout off what you think they have a problem with. Like you mentioned the flu vaccine. Maybe you're automatically going to assume maybe they're like, oh, I don't like whatever preservative is in it or whatnot. And you automatically go down that road. But then maybe it's that they knew someone that one time had a really bad autoimmune response and had Guillain-Barré. But that's not even something you went to, because that's not normally what someone, but like, then they're like, no, I don't care what it's made of. I just have a problem with, I know someone who experienced this. What are the chances that I will experience this? And how often does it happen? And then you can fight that battle instead of maybe fighting 5 other battles you didn't need to fight to begin with.
Creating more problems for yourself.
Exactly. Yes. I want to go into current events, because I feel like there's a whole lot, and not really any of it good, going on with science communication right now. I have in my notes a few of the main things currently going on that are easily able to just Google and search. So different censorship and suppression of scientific information, freezing and limiting funding to research, certain terms being kept out of research funding or research proposals or in information of any type. So we can dive in wherever we want. So where do we want to go? Do you want to maybe go in with like censorship and suppression of scientific information? One thing, I was looking into this the other day, one thing that I found related to the EPA There's just like a screening tool. It's called the EJ Screen Mapping Tool. It's a tool that looks at environmental and demographic information in a specific like geographic area, and that tool has been removed. And it's not that the information isn't publicly available. You can still find that same information. It is just way more difficult and could be in like 3 different places instead of being able to look at all 3 of these, the geographic location, the environmental information, and the specific area all in one. You got to find it everywhere else. Why some people might say that's just an extra tool we didn't need, taking up extra money or extra space or whatever, because we can get the information. What would you guys say to that argument? Like, just because you can find it elsewhere, why is it something like that necessary?
Yeah. I mean, I think what it comes down to is that when we spend money on something like developing this tool, maintaining this tool, for instance, how many people are required to, make sure that it's working correctly. I think that people tend to view that as, or some people tend to view that as, look at this money that we're spending on this. It's wasteful spending, without actually seeing how much it is saving us in the long run. And public health is, of course, saves so much money. And you don't know, like, public health works and you don't realize it's working. It's when it stops working that people will start to realize that it's working. And I think that the making it more difficult, censoring this information, not being able to collect data, it all serves the purpose of increasing mistrust in these institutions. And it also serves the purpose of deregulation and redefining expertise. So if we're not regulating water anymore, then are we going to hire some company to come in and control the water and test for the water and stuff like that? Like, the problems are not going to go away. They're just going to become more obscured. And I think that's the whole goal. And it really does worry me sort of in the long run when we have this, Aaron and I have always said, like, okay, well, you get your information, CDC website is a great place to go. I don't know how long we will feel comfortable saying that, because of the amount of control that is being, I guess, how much control the CDC is now under someone who is an anti-science individual, ultimately. And so where do people go to get their information? Here in Colorado, I think legislators are currently working on a bill to try to protect the childhood vaccine mandates in schools. And what they're doing is, I think they're also allowing the schools to follow guidelines, not just from ACIP, which is, of course, ultimately headed by RFK Jr., but also by the American Academy of Pediatrics and other professional organizations that don't have this are not controlled through this political mechanism, essentially. And so, that's a very long-winded answer, but I think that it is terrifying is the bottom line. And we're going to have to really refocus how we think about these institutions that, yes, have been problematic throughout history, yes, have made mistakes, but now it's going to be much more difficult to acknowledge and to see what those mistakes are when this transparency is removed.
Yeah. And you brought up a good point with other organizations. The more reliable information is going to probably end up having to come from like the private organizations that normally, like you said, you would go to the CDC, and all these other organizations are supplemental, but ultimately CDC was going to be your number one go-to. But now it could be things like APIC or SHEA or the different medical specialties organizations. Those ones are going to be the ones that they probably need to step it up and go ahead and become those stronger sources of information and become the reliable sources, because there's a gap that's coming and we need to fill that.
Yeah.
Sure.
There's also the World Health Organization.
Let's
not forget we're not alone in this globe.
Yes. So with the different like censorship and suppression, we've got some freezing and limiting of funding related to research. So there have been a variety of scientific research grants that have been terminated at varying levels of whether they're in the beginning or in the middle of the research. It's impacted I know some like cancer studies and just a whole variety of different studies. I saw an article in Politico where it talked about canceling funding for the U.S. Global Change Research Program. So this is what produces the government's like big signature climate change study. And it is something that was mandated in 1990 by the Global Change Research Act to be done every 4 years so that the government understands the threats of climate change and increasing temperatures and what is behind the climate change. And there was a contract that was canceled. So the next assessment is supposed to be done in 27, and it's still mandated. It is still a Congress mandated requirement, but now there is no active contract for them to be able to even do this in 2027 because it cannot go forward.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like you were talking about, the public health issues are still going to come.
Mm-hmm.
You don't know that there's a problem right away necessarily or see the impacts, but we don't do this study and we don't know what's going on let's see, we're in 2025. So within the next 2 years, that could impact multiple years ahead of that because we're behind the curve already.
Yeah. I think these cuts, this drop in funding, I'm not sure where the executive order stands now. I think there's been pushback on limiting overhead costs for NIH grants down to 15% when it used to be, negotiated per institution, but much higher than that. This will be felt generationally. There are graduate programs that are suspending admission for incoming students. This will cause such a drop and a brain drain in terms of scientists that are being trained here, scientists that are willing to work here, both people from the US as well as people not from the US. Who's going to want to come here if their visa is not considered, not viewed as valid, if they are constantly under threat? I do feel like this is where I start to doom spiral about this, because I'm just like, right now there are people whose jobs are lost, whose livelihoods are done, and then where are they going to find another job when all of these grants are cut across the board, all of their training is cut across the board, and then we're not training the next generation of scientists. And then there are the people who are at universities now are going to have to take on more work because the universities won't be able to keep all of the different employees, but all the jobs will remain. And so it's like, all the jobs, all the responsibilities will remain, all the teaching responsibilities, all the number of students who are enrolling. And that is just the human impact. Then there's the scientific impact. And what sort of implications will this have for the information that we gain and the information that it is out there and lost? Like, it is, every single person, I feel like, will be affected by this, because who out there has not taken any medication ever, who has not gone to the doctor, who has not benefited directly from the knowledge that people gained through studies from the NIH and other research organizations? That's just the health side of things too. And then you mentioned like the climate change side of things, the emissions, the environmental testing, water quality, like all of these things. It's terrifying to see the road that we are going to be going down. And I think what's additionally scary about that is that we're not going to know, because all of the funding has been cut to measure the road that we're going down. It's depressing. Sorry.
Well, and with that not knowing, then you have the specific populations that are being eliminated from research. And so just because you don't agree with something doesn't mean that they don't exist, or that their health doesn't impact the health of everybody else as well. So I forget what the list was I saw, but it was I think it was a list of like an insane amount of words that the words were being flagged in research proposals, I believe. And there were a ton. It was anything from female to LGBTQ to gender. Like, there were things that it was a word that would be as simple as this. It wasn't a word, but it comes across in like demographics was, I think, maybe one of the words. It was insane the number of words that were on this list that's going to potentially flag research proposals to at the least be under elevated scrutiny to make sure they could go through. And I'm not saying oversight or scrutiny is bad. I don't think any of us would say that, but like to flag for these words that are also generally available in most research studies, period, is a waste of time at a minimum and going to hurt research and studies and information in the long run also.
Yeah. And I mean, it really just comes down to the current government, the current administration wanting to have total control over the information that is available. And that, I think, ultimately is what is so scary, because if you control that flow of information, then you control essentially everything about that population. Because if we can't access information despite the availability of the internet, if we can't access this information because there is no more information coming down the pipeline, because there is no research going on, because we have lost faith in the institutions that are supposed to provide this information, then, you know, that is when you have total control of this population, because you can essentially just manipulate and propaganda to your will. And so that, I think, is what for me, what makes all of this so scary, like just the amount of control that they're exerting, essentially.
And then looking at the layoffs of the different organizations, whether it be CDC, EPA, NIH, HHS,
FDA.
yeah, and so that outside of the human aspect, like you mentioned, that it is just hurting those individuals, but like that is going to significantly compromise our ability as a country to be able to manage these chronic or infectious diseases, or heaven forbid we have another pandemic that I don't think any of us would say we handled that great in 2020. Right. So like, how are we going to handle something like that very well with 50% of the workforce in those areas still around? Yeah. So how are we going to tackle that? Like, we can't.
We can't.
No, we're not. We won't.
I mean, isn't the solution if you don't count the cases, then there's no pandemic. There's nothing to worry about. Then they're not there, right?
Right. Yeah. Totally how I see that in infection prevention. 100%.
That's how it works.
Definitely. You talked a little bit about this already, but with all these limits, where should people go for accurate information, and how do they know that it's accurate? How can they fact check it, or not know, but know as well as you can? How can you verify that something is reliable or accurate?
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, I think the organizations that we mentioned, that WHO, of course, and then these, I think, professional organizations are good sources of information. I normally would also recommend like Google Scholar, but a lot of those are primary literature that's difficult to sift through, and it's really difficult to read. They're not made hard to interpret. They're not really made for general consumption. It's actually really funny. I was thinking about this. I was collecting sources for, we're doing an episode or a couple of episodes probably on fluoride. And I was realizing that the amount of books about fluoride are largely negative they're largely anti-fluoridation. Because books don't have to go through a peer review process. They don't have to have this approval by other scientists to be like, yes, this is a valid study. And there are journals out there that are also anti-science or anti-fluoridation in this specific instance, or international societies or whatever. Anyone can call themselves an international society. And so I think that I would not recommend books by and large which is wild, because I love books. Yeah. Like reading is my favorite. But I think that science books, unless you can verify, there are two different rules for science books that I typically use to be like, is this a legit book? One is I will put that book title into Google Scholar and see if there are any reviews written by scientists in a peer-reviewed journal, like a professional journal. And if there are, and then I'll read the review, see what it says, see if it's like, usually that means that it is somewhat legitimate, at least to some degree. If there aren't, that raises a red flag for me. Maybe that it's new, maybe that it's just not very well read. That's possible. Then I'll look up the credentials of the author themselves. What is their research? Have they published on anything else? Do they seem to be like well respected in their field? What professional organizations do they belong to? Have they written any op-ed pieces, maybe on YouTube? And this is the thing, is that it's not easy. This is a process, and I have a PhD. Like, I've trained for years in how to read scientific literature, and it's still really hard to know whether information is valid, especially outside of my background, outside of my field of study. And so that is it's all really challenging. But maybe Erin, maybe you have other up to date.
I do use Up to Date pretty heavily, but not everyone has access to that because it costs money.
Yeah.
But the other thing I would say, Erin, because I know that you actually do think this when you're reading books, so you forgot this, is do they cite their sources?
Do they cite their sources? Yeah. Richard Preston in the Hot Zone does not cite his sources.
So I think that's a big key for us. And so whenever I think you're trying to evaluate, like right now, I still rely heavily on the CDC. Right now, as of today, it is April 16th. I still rely heavily on the CDC. I still rely on the World Health Organization. A lot of these professional organizations, be they the American Academy of Pediatrics, American Academy of Family Practitioners, the AMA, any individual society, depending on what type of question that you have. But those are going to be professional organizations that you can look to. There's also, if you're talking about like, how do you find legitimate sources online? We'd like to think that we're a legitimate source, but who are we? Just a bunch of two people just talking at you? One of the ways that we try and, reassure people that what we are saying is legitimate is that we do cite our sources. And so when you're looking at maybe creators or things like that online, where are they getting their information? And this is another key, I think, is how much are they acknowledging the nuance of a problem versus overstating or kind of oversimplifying these issues. Because I think that is what I have seen a lot online in kind of looking at like, who are these creators who are just like spouting misinformation and what kinds of things are they saying? A lot of it is this very like broad sweeping statements about things with really no nuance, and no like willingness to admit that there are limits to our knowledge. And I think that is one of the things that you can look for. If you're just talking about like, I see a TikTok video, how do I know if this seems like it's legitimate? And it is tough because people are getting better at like, there's a lot of these, well, how can this be fake if there's this paper? And then they cite some paper that actually has nothing to do with what they're talking about, but it makes it seem a lot more legitimate. So it is getting harder and harder, but those are, I think, some of the ways that you can kind of look. Is there a broad consensus for the information that's being shared, or does it seem to be this like, ooh, we're, taking a stab at the scientific data? Like, is that real, or is that just someone who's trying to get you to buy a supplement?
Yeah. So unfortunately, the person who is receiving the information or looking for it, they have to really care to make sure that it's accurate information, because it's 100%. A lot of work to figure out if it is accurate.
Yeah.
I want to go out of current events. We made it out.
We made it out.
We survived.
That was tough. How do we see science communication evolving? And specifically looking at like artificial intelligence, whether that be like generative AI, like how do we see things moving forward and going on as we move past all the bad?
It's a good question about AI. I need to do more reading about AI through a legitimate book source. But no, I think that one of the things, and I haven't played around with this, but Notebook LM is like, I think Google's AI feature where it generates a kind of like a podcast episode, a conversation between two people. And I think that honestly, at first I was like, this is uncanny valley. What is this? I'm terrified. And they're using analogies, and they're like, it's very casual. There's like joking, there's laughing involved. And I was like, this is alarming, but also it's gratifying in a way, because I'm like, oh, the things that we're doing on the podcast work. And I think it's fascinating that that the AI is seeing that sort of aspect of it. Right now, I don't think I will ever use AI or ChatGPT. That's just not, I don't trust these sources and where it gets the information well enough to do anything like that. I still will be my own generative AI in that regard. And it's a lot of work, but it's fine. But I think, the way that I see science communication evolving, and this has been something that's been really also inspiring. I think when we go and we give talks, especially at different universities, people, we say in our talk, oh, well, science communication is not often prioritized or incentivized during our training as grad students or as medical doctors or whatever capacity, whatever other professional training you're receiving. And we had we ask students afterwards, like, is this still your experience? Are you gaining science communication skills? Erin and I did not. And maybe that training was available to us, but it was optional and it was something that we had to seek out. And now it seems like students are more and more, it is part of the curriculum. That is incredible. That I think there is this wider recognition that we have to get better at talking about science, about our own science, about the science that we're doing. And so I think that's the way that I see science communication evolving, is just the skills are hopefully becoming more and more widespread, and people are seeing the need and the importance of science communication.
I think we covered a lot today. Do you guys have anything that you would want listeners to, main points to take away from this, or about science communication, just like kind of just the overall importance or what?
I feel like there are two in our talk that we can each take one. I'll take the my favorite one, which is don't let perfect be the enemy of good. So like if you're wanting to do science communication, and just like with our first episode that we ever did, and it was certainly not perfect, and I would even be challenged to say that it was good, but I think just like doing something and just getting in the habit of doing something in science communication, then that is what you should do. Don't like, wordsmith till the end of time. Don't feel like, okay, I'll practice and practice and practice and then I can do it. Just do it and it gets easier.
Yeah. I don't know if I'm going to say the right thing here, Erin, but
you will.
I think one of the things for me that is kind of my biggest takeaway, especially as we get to do these talks and as we hear from people who are listening, is that it is very easy to doom spiral and to think that this is all hopeless and that there's nothing that we can do about the current state of the world that we're in. But that's not true. And I think that the biggest thing is that we all, like anyone who's listening to this, anyone who is worried about the state of the world, all of us can continue to make this positive change. And I think a big part of it is, like Erin said, it's doing whatever it is that you can. It is not giving up the hope that what we are all doing is making a difference, and it is important. And there are other people out there who are also doing this, who are fighting these battles of misinformation, who are legislating for changes to this, who are fighting through the court systems. Like there's millions of different ways that people are standing up for science and for science communication. And all of us continuing to do this in whatever our niche is what is going to continue to make the difference. And it's, we can't just like fall into the middle of the doom spiral. We have to like crawl our way out somehow.
Yeah, we do.
Wonderfully said. Did she get it right?
I don't know.
Great. Yeah, no.
So where can my listeners find you guys? Where can they listen to your podcast, follow you on social media, website, all the things?
This Podcast Will Kill You. We're at This Podcast Will Kill You on Instagram and Facebook and Blue Sky somewhere.
On Blue Sky.
Yeah.
We're
We've got
on
a
YouTube
website
now.
YouTube.
Which is pretty cool. We've got a website, thispodcastwillkillyou.com, that has a lot of
all
stuff
of the
on it.
podcatchers. We're there.
Wherever you get your podcasts.
Wherever you like to.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you again for joining me. This has been so much fun.
Thank you. It was
hopefully
fun.
We can record an episode again in the future and keep in touch. So thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks. Thank you all for listening today. I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did. As always, you can email me at rochellebeard@outlook.com, or I have a brand new website for my infection prevention and quality improvement consulting. It is www.rbipconsulting.com. Thank you again. Have a great one.